Did you know that Ethiopia, once a symbol of economic ambition in Africa, is now on the brink of disaster? The Tigray conflict, combined with ethnic tensions and a deepening humanitarian crisis, threatens to tear the country apart. With millions displaced, its economy in tatters, and growing unrest, Ethiopia is at risk of collapse by 2024. But Ethiopia is not the only country facing such turmoil. Today I'm going to talk about countries that could collapse by 2024. If you want to learn more about the challenges these places are facing, follow along. Number 1. Ethiopia. Ethiopia's conflict in the Tigray region has plunged the country into one of its worst crises in decades. The conflict, which began in November 2020, has led to thousands of deaths and displaced millions of people. The fighting has also spilled over into neighboring regions, threatening the stability of the entire country. The conflict has its roots in long-standing political and ethnic tensions, particularly between the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF) and the central government. Despite efforts to negotiate a ceasefire, the fighting continues, with both sides accusing each other of atrocities. Ethiopia's economy has also been severely impacted by the conflict. The country, once one of Africa's fastest growing economies, has seen its growth stall, with inflation rising and food prices soaring. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the economic situation, leaving millions of Ethiopians struggling to make ends meet. As Ethiopia faces 2024, the country is at a crossroads. The conflict in Tigray shows no signs of abating, and the government faces growing unrest in other regions. The international community will need to play a crucial role in mediating the conflict and preventing further instability. Number 2. Yemen. Yemen's civil war has devastated the nation, turning it into a battleground for regional powers. The conflict, which began in 2015, has its roots in political divisions that were exacerbated by the Arab Spring. However, it quickly escalated into a full-scale war, with Saudi Arabia and Iran backing opposing sides. The result has been catastrophic: thousands dead, millions displaced, and a country on the brink of famine. The situation in Yemen is made even worse by the economic blockade imposed by the Saudi-led coalition, which has crippled the country's ability to import food, medicine, and fuel. The United Nations has called it the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 80% of the population in need of assistance. Despite multiple attempts at peace talks, the conflict shows no signs of abating. The Houthi rebels, who control large parts of the country, remain defiant, while the internationally recognized government struggles to maintain its legitimacy. Meanwhile, extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQA, and ISIS have taken advantage of the chaos to expand their influence. What makes Yemen's plight even more tragic is the lack of a foreseeable solution. The conflict, fueled by regional powers, shows no signs of abating. For the people of Yemen, 2024 might not bring relief, but further devastation. Number 3. Haiti. Haiti's history is a tragic tale of natural disasters, political instability, and economic hardship. From the devastating earthquake in 2010 to the more recent assassination of President Jovenel Moise in 2021, Haiti has been in a state of constant crisis. The political vacuum left by Moise's death has only exacerbated the country's woes, with gang violence spiraling out of control and the government struggling to assert its authority. Haiti's economic situation is equally dire. The country is the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, with more than half of its population living below the poverty line. The COVID-19 pandemic has only deepened the country's economic woes, with inflation soaring and unemployment rising. Social unrest is rampant, with protests frequently erupting over issues such as fuel prices, corruption, and government inefficiency. The international community, particularly the United States, has been heavily involved in Haiti's affairs, but their efforts have often been criticized as ineffective or counterproductive. The economic situation in Haiti has deteriorated to the point where basic necessities are becoming luxuries. Gang-controlled areas are growing, and the government's grip on power is weakening. In 2024, Haiti teeters on the edge, with its people caught between a rock and a hard place. Number 4. Sudan. Sudan's story is one of potential derailed by conflict. The military coup in 2021 shattered hopes for a peaceful transition to democracy. Now, Sudan finds itself in the throes of political turmoil, with protests frequently erupting across the country. The ongoing conflict in Darfur, despite peace agreements, continues to displace thousands and contribute to the nation's instability. Economically, Sudan is collapsing under the weight of inflation, making life increasingly difficult for its citizens. As international support wanes, and with no clear path forward, 2024 might be the year Sudan's delicate balance tips into chaos. Number 5. Venezuela. Once one of Latin America's wealthiest countries, Venezuela is now synonymous with economic collapse. Hyperinflation has rendered the currency nearly worthless, and millions of people have fled the country in search of basic survival. Despite its vast oil reserves, Venezuela's economy is a shadow of its former self, crippled by years of corruption and mismanagement. Politically, the country remains locked in a bitter struggle between President Nicolas Maduro and his opposition. The humanitarian crisis continues to deepen, with shortages of food, medicine, and other essentials becoming more acute. As 2024 dawns, the question remains whether Venezuela can find a way out of its freefall, or if it will continue its downward spiral. Number 6. Afghanistan. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 marked a new chapter in Afghanistan's long history of conflict. While the international community has largely withdrawn, the country's internal challenges have only grown. The economy is in shambles, with widespread poverty and food insecurity. Meanwhile, the Taliban's strict rule has stifled freedoms, particularly for women and minorities. Afghanistan's future is uncertain. Resistance movements continue to challenge the Taliban's authority, while extremist groups like ISIS-K pose a constant threat. With the international spotlight shifting elsewhere, Afghanistan risks becoming a forgotten crisis in 2024. Number 7. Pakistan. Pakistan faces a multitude of challenges that threaten its stability in 2024. The country is grappling with a severe economic crisis, with inflation soaring and foreign reserves dwindling. Political instability has plagued Pakistan, with frequent changes in leadership and ongoing tensions between the civilian government and the military. Meanwhile, the threat of terrorism looms large, particularly from groups like the TTP. Relations with neighboring India remain tense, particularly over Kashmir, further straining Pakistan's resources. Climate change is also exacerbating the country's challenges, with floods and heat waves becoming more common. In 2024, Pakistan faces the daunting task of addressing these issues before they spiral out of control. Number 8. Myanmar's military coup in 2021 plunged the country into chaos, reversing years of democratic progress. The military's brutal crackdown on protests has led to thousands of deaths and the displacement of over 1 million people. The conflict has also reignited ethnic tensions, with armed groups in the country's border regions taking up arms against the central government. Economically, Myanmar is in dire straits. Businesses have shut down, and foreign investment has all but dried up. The international community's sanctions have further isolated the country. As Myanmar faces 2024, the path forward looks increasingly uncertain, with the potential for further conflict and collapse. Number 9. Somalia has been a symbol of instability for decades, with the insurgent group Al-Shabaab maintaining a stronghold over large parts of the country. The central government, despite international support, remains weak and unable to exert full control over its territory. The lack of security has stifled development and humanitarian efforts, with millions of Somalis facing severe food insecurity. The combination of insurgency, drought, and famine has left Somalia teetering on the brink. In 2024, the country's fragile state will be tested further as it battles both natural and man-made disasters. Number 10. Lebanon, once the Paris of the Middle East, now finds itself drowning in economic despair. The collapse of its currency has left the vast majority of its population in poverty, and basic services are on the verge of non-existence. Beirut's port explosion in 2020 shattered not just buildings, but also whatever trust remained in Lebanon's political elite. With rampant corruption and political deadlock, the Lebanese people find themselves in a land with fading hope. As international aid diminishes, and with no functional government to address the myriad issues, Lebanon's fate looks increasingly bleak. In 2024, Lebanon stands as a symbol of how quickly a nation can descend from prosperity to peril. The streets once bustling with life are now filled with protests, poverty, and an ever-present sense of despair. Number 11. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, is facing multiple crises that threaten its stability. The Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, the rise of banditry and kidnapping in the northwest, and the ongoing conflict between herders and farmers in the Middle Belt have created a security nightmare for the government. The Boko Haram insurgency, which began in 2009, has killed tens of thousands of people and displaced millions. Despite efforts by the Nigerian military to defeat the group, Boko Haram remains a potent potent threat, with its offshoot, the Islamic State West Africa province, ISWAP, also gaining strength. The rise of banditry in the northwest has added to Nigeria's security challenges. Armed groups, often referred to as bandits, have been responsible for mass kidnappings, attacks on villages, and cattle rustling. The government has struggled to contain the violence, with many Nigerians feeling abandoned by the state. The conflict between herders and farmers in the Middle Belt is driven by competition over land and resources. Climate change has exacerbated the situation, with desertification forcing herders to move south in search of grazing land. The resulting clashes have left thousands dead and displaced millions. Economically, Nigeria is also struggling. The country, heavily dependent on oil exports, has been hit hard by the global decline in oil prices. Inflation is soaring, and unemployment is at record levels. The COVID-19 pandemic has further worsened the situation, with millions of Nigerians pushed into poverty. As Nigeria faces 2024, the country is at a tipping point. The government must address the multiple security challenges facing the country, as well as the economic crisis, if it is to prevent further instability. The international community will also need to provide support to help Nigeria navigate these challenges. Number 12. Sri Lanka is attempting to recover from one of its worst economic crises in recent history. Massive protests in 2022 led to a change in leadership, and the country has since secured a bailout from the IMF. However, challenges remain, with high levels of debt, unemployment, and inflation continuing to affect the population. The political landscape in Sri Lanka remains volatile, with deep-seated divisions between different ethnic and religious groups. The country is also highly vulnerable to climate change, with rising sea levels and natural disasters threatening its stability. As Sri Lanka faces 2024, the question is whether it can continue its recovery or if it will slide back into crisis. The collapse of a nation is never an isolated event. It is the result of years of economic mismanagement, political corruption, social unrest, and often external pressures. As we look toward 2024, these 12 countries stand on the precipice, their futures uncertain. The ripple effects of their potential collapse will be felt far beyond their borders, impacting regional stability, global markets, and humanitarian efforts. Understanding the dynamics at play in these nations is crucial. Whether through diplomacy, aid, or intervention, the international community has a role to play in preventing further collapse. But ultimately, the fate of these countries will depend on the resilience and determination of their people, and whether they can overcome the myriad challenges they face. As 2024 unfolds, the world will be watching closely, hoping for recovery, but preparing for the worst.